Hey there, this time we're going to be talking about Chapter 5 of Division 1 of Being and Time, which is the chapter in which Heidegger talks about what he calls being in. We already talked about being in at the beginning of this little lecture course. Being in is how we're involved in the world, and I was characterizing that as inhabitation. So that's where we began. But so when he's talking about being in, he's talking about our modes of encountering. When he's talking about the world, he's talking about what we encounter. Now, our reality is being in the world, and so that means the world isn't something that can simply be separated off from our modes of encountering. Like, we are that being in that world. That's what he means when he says at the beginning of chapter 5, it's a whole. We're not finding different pieces. We're taking up that whole and looking at it in different ways. But the point is, we can talk about the ongoing sort of unitary happening of experience, either from the side of what is experienced or from the side of how we're encountering it. So, some of this will become clear as we go, but I hope that makes a little bit of sense. Anyway, when we're talking about our ways of encountering, right, the thing he's calling being in, he's basically talking about the same thing that people would commonly talk about when they use language like consciousness. Right? Because we would say, what is it that a person or a subject brings to experience? So we come with consciousness. But consciousness is a word that he specifically wants to avoid. Because not because it's an inherently bad word. You could use it in a satisfactory way to talk about some of the things he wants to talk about, or a lot of the things. But the way we usually talk about it brings a lot of problematic baggage with it. Specifically, when people talk about consciousness, they usually think of it as this little sort of mental bubble. Like, you think of it as this kind of the private domain of that thing that you think of as subjectivity or whatever. And you think of it as just, it's like a container where your ideas are. And then you wonder, like, how do these ideas match up to some external reality, right? And that's what we call generally actually a representational model of consciousness, right? The idea that in consciousness there are these contents which are representations of a world, and we wonder how they match up. Well, that's the thing he's trying to get away from, right? He doesn't want to use the word consciousness because he thinks that way of talking about our experience completely misconstrues what our experience is actually like. Because remember, he wants to say we're thrown out into the world. So it's not about sort of retreating into a little mental bubble. It's about actually practically being wrapped up with a world that is disclosed to you through your behaviors and so on, a lot of which is happening below the level of reflection, etc., etc., and which is what I was calling inhabitation. And so the word he wants to use as a substitute, where others might talk about consciousness, is care. Care is the basic word he wants to use to try to name what we bring to our experience, what we're doing, so to speak. We are the ones who are caring, and so what he's trying to say then is that the how the world is disclosed to us is responsive to how we care. So in this chapter, he's going to be looking at the different modes of our caring. Now, in a way, he's already done that. In the chapter, Division 1, Chapter 3, about the world to the world, which is the chapter in which we talked about things that are ready to hand or present at hand, he said, well, you can have this thing he calls concern. That was his name for the attitude we bring. Or in dealing with other beings who have the character of Dasein, he said we bring the attitude of solicitude. So there, he's already named our attitudes, our ways of responding to these things. Those are different modes of care, and in fact, the language he uses for that, concern is translating the word besorga, and solicitude is translating the word fürsorge, and those words both have that root zorga in them, which is what care is. So he is saying those are two different modes of caring. But there, those modes of caring are being differentiated by the kind of objects, the kinds of worldly realities we're concerned about. When we're relating to other beings with the character of Dasein, we have this kind of concern, this kind of care, solicitude. When we're behaving towards realities that don't have that character, we have this kind of concern, right? So there he was distinguishing two kinds of care, but he was distinguishing from the point of view of that with which we are engaged. In this chapter, he's going to distinguish modes of caring, but not from the point of view of their object, but rather from the point of view of something like the different dimensions of our, for lack of a better word, subjectivity. I said he doesn't like the word consciousness. He doesn't actually like the word subjectivity either. I use it a lot. I use it in the book Sites of Exposure that we're also talking about, and I use it in talking about him. He doesn't like it for reasons similar to the reasons he doesn't like consciousness, because when people talk about subjects, they tend to imagine this sort of separate substance and so on. All good concerns, but like consciousness, you can use the word subjectivity if you want. It just matters that you use it the right way. So I use it because I think in our sort of comfortable English ways, it works to say something quite well that he's trying to say. But it's worth knowing that though I use that word, he actually doesn't. Anyway, but what he's going to look at in this chapter, to stick with my language of subjectivity, is the different distinctive modes or sort of domains of what you could almost call subjective meaning, how things can be meaningful to us, or the dimensions in which we can encounter them. So that's what he's going to talk about, and he names three. Roughly, mood, understanding, and articulation. As we go on to talk about this, that will become clear what those things are, especially our articulation of sort of language, basically. That might not immediately seem like a mode in which something is being disclosed, but we'll get to that. The relevant thing, or the easier thing to grasp right off the bat, is mood and understanding. Like, those are two familiar kinds of words we use to talk about ways we can be experiencing something or ways we can be responding to something. And that's what he's going to pick up on. He's going to pick up on those two different dimensions of how things can strike us and grip us. But we'll get to that in a little while. I'm just trying to alert you to what the topic of this chapter is. But anyway, to get into this chapter and to get into talking about care, I want to begin briefly by going back, excuse me, to Division 1, Chapter 3, the end of that chapter, to sections 20 and 21, I think. Is that right? Sorry, 22 and 23. Wrong ones. 22 and 23. Where he talks about Dasein's spatiality, or what we could talk about Dasein's lived experience of space. The things I'm going to talk about here, I'm not going to go into it in detail because I'm going to read just a few passages, but the ideas here I've actually already talked about when I've been talking about the experience of being at home. And if you read, I think especially lesson 4 in this one about home, that will really help, in Sites of Exposure, that will really help to fill out some of that stuff. But I'm going to read a couple of these remarks just to get you into that part of the text and to remind you of some of the issues we've talked about in order to launch our talking about care and chapter 5. And I think I'm going to start, though, by looking at a couple of images. I'm going to use a few images from the great Canadian artist Jeff Wall. I think a lot of his images are particularly good for the kind of thing that I want to get at. So let's look at this one first. This is Card Players. It's from 2006. His images are, I think, they're photographs. I don't know exactly what the proper name is, but they're basically photographs that are in boxes and illuminated from behind, for what that's worth. But here, I want you to think of these people, think about what they're doing, and think about what their experience of that room is. They're sitting at a table, but they're really wrapped up in the game. Do you remember I talked about in the other Jeff Wall we looked at, The View from an Apartment? I talked about the way the woman sitting on the couch, is looking at the magazine, and in a sense, her eyes are receiving, the visual signals from the words on the page, but um, but she's not even really seeing that exactly. She's really, what she's engaged with is what those words are saying. Well, similarly here, these women are, uh, uh, they, like I'm looking at the woman in the sort of purpley dress, like she will have some kind of tactile experience of the table under her elbow and of the cards in her fingers and of the chair on her back and so on, floor under her feet, and she'll be seeing whatever it is, the red hearts on the cards she's looking at and so on. But if you think about what's actually going on in her experience, the um, the sort of narrow way to describe it is she's seeing, what card she's going to lead with. Like that's what she's grappling with. More broadly, she's experiencing herself as in a card game with these other people. Try to put yourself in that situation of you playing a game and think about what it's like to sort of be inhabiting the perspective of one of those people when they're looking at their cards and what you're dealing with. And so if you think of that white door that you can see there, and you ask, what role is that playing in their experience? Or if you look up on that the cupboard on the back wall there, and at the top of it there's some ornamental sort of things, and it looks like there's a little pink elephant over at one side. You think, what role is that having in their experience right now? What role is the little bowl of nuts or whatever that is on the table having? What role are the paintings behind the woman in the striped shirt having in the experience of the woman in the yellow or the woman in the purple? Like, all those things are there, visually available, but think about what the lived form of their experience is. The main thing I would want to say there is that, well, to put it simply, they notice what matters to them. And this, I imagine these people are actually pretty charged up, like they're into the game. And maybe, one woman is up, whatever game they're playing, 50 points or something like that. And this other woman is thinking, oh, I'm going to win this hand or something like that. Just try to picture that situation. Actually, that's the word I really want to use, situation. I want you to think about a situation. In that situation, those people feel at home in that room. They feel comfortable in that room. And, when if one of them has to pee, like they quickly will go to the bathroom, or if one of them needs a drink of water, I guess they'll go behind that white door probably and get water from the sink or something. If we brought out a ruler and measured the distance from where, let's say, the woman in the purple dress is sitting to where the sink is that she's going to get a glass of water from, according to the ruler, it might be, let's say, 20 feet. And if you measure the distance from her to that pink elephant up on the corner of that cabinet, it's only going to be 9 feet. So according to math, according to number, quantity of distance, it seems like that little pink ornament is much closer to her than the kitchen sink. But oddly, experientially, the opposite is true. I imagine that pink ornament is infinitely far away from her. It's not something that's ever gonna mean anything to her in her living experience here. Whereas it's probably a kind of a regular thing in this meeting that they get up to get more peanuts, or they get up to get a drink of coffee, or they get up to get a glass of water. And so the kitchen sink is almost a part of this room. If you go back and think about Heidegger talking about the work world of the carpenter or whatever, or the carpenter I looked at in the Marode altarpiece, we talked about the way the tools are ready to hand, and sort of like you as a living body are with all those things all the time, and they come up as you call upon them. They're there for you when you need them. And so in a kind of extended way, like this goes beyond where their arms can reach right now, but in that kind of extended way, the kitchen sink is ready for them, and they just call it up to use it whenever they need it. Whereas that little pink elephant isn't part of the network of equipment and so on. With that little loose start, let's that sort of basic sort of description of that room. Let's just look at the text here quickly. In section 22, which is page 135 of Being in Time, Heidegger says, this is about 2/3 of the way down the page, what is ready to hand in our everyday dealings has the character of closeness. Well, closeness is a spatial word. He's saying things are close to us. But notice they're not close in the sense of the number of inches you would measure off on a ruler. They're close in the sense of intimacy. They're close in the sense of being integrated into your living practical engagement with the situation. And then, so as he says, 2 more lines down, every entity that is two-hand has a different closeness, which is not to be ascertained by measuring distances in that mathematical sense. Right? So the point he's making there, I think, is basically the point I was trying to make about what it's like for those people to be in their room. And as he says also, when you're thinking about our living engagement with a space, on the next page, 136, he says on line 3, equipment has its place, or else it lies around. But this must be distinguished in principle from just occurring at random in some spatial position. There, the thing is, it's not so much that you have labeled out around your house, this thing belongs here, this thing belongs here, this thing belongs here. Like, it's not that. It's more that in your living engagement with things, the environment that you live in with your practical means of supporting your life and doing whatever it is you're doing, those things are kind of organized for you, kind of like the way your hand and your elbow and your shoulder and your hips and your neck are organized for you in your body. Like they have their place, not just in the sense that you could photograph them and put on, say on a map, here's where this thing is, but in the sense that they work together in an integrated way. You know, your hand is here with respect to your mouth and your shoulder and your pocket, you know. So the interesting thing about the spatiality of your body when you're working with it is that the different parts that are situated with respect to each other, in the sense that they have a living, meaningful connection to them, which again is not, it's not about a measure of distance in a rulerish sense. It's that my hip, or that my hip and my hip pocket is close to my hand. Like they work in a kind of paired way. But if I'm sitting at a chair, you know, even though the chair I'm sitting on is only, or you know, this table I'm sitting at or whatever is just the same number of inches away, I don't have that same paired connection with it. Or somebody else's pocket would be an even better example. I can be sitting right beside someone, and you know, that person's pocket on it might be as close, or maybe in some cases even closer than mine mathematically, but in a way that person's pocket practically is infinitely far away from my hand, whereas my hand is always, and my pocket are always close. So there's like a lived pairing between those things. The way I experience my hand, it already has that pocket on its meaningful horizon, and so it's close in its very way of existing. It's close in its being. And so what it means to say it has its proper place is that sense that these things are like a network. He said before, there's no such thing as an equipment, right? It's always a network. And this is just another way of talking about a network. Things are integrated with each other, right? And so as he says, in each case, the place is this is about 10 more lines down. In each case, the place is a definite there or yonder of an item of equipment that belongs somewhere. So, I mean, that probably does also mean that typically the thing has its proper resting place on the shelf or whatever, but it's that's its proper place, but it's also that it's integrated into relationship with all these other pieces and places, right? So he says that, so then a little bit more, he then talks about a notion of a region. And I guess he's saying, you know, the things are integrated into something like a workspace or the card playing space or whatever. You know, so those women, when they're playing cards, live in that environment in the way that things are defined places are defined with respect to each other from the point of view of the demands of the card game. But when the guests leave and the woman who lives there takes up her normal life again, in a way her spatial situation is going to get rearranged a bit, because she's going to relate to the bathroom or the kitchen or that table differently, because they function differently when she's making dinner for her son or watching television in the afternoon or whatever. Anyway, so he says on 137, regions are not first formed by things which are present at hand. They always are ready to hand already in individual places. Places themselves either get allotted to the ready hand in the circumspection of concern, or else we come upon them. Da 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 da. I mean, I think he goes on in that paragraph. It's worth reading that. I mean, I think the basic thing he's saying is that when we're talking about, what I'm talking about here is kind of the lived region of the card game or whatever. We're not just talking about something that happens to get assembled by having the table and having the kitchen sink and having the deck of cards and the peanuts or whatever. Rather, there is a kind of a meaningful whole there, and you kind of inhabit that whole setting, and within that context, places get articulated, right? And so it's the region isn't just an assembly of different parts and places. It's a kind of integral whole. And I think there's one more thing I want to say. Oh yeah, okay. So that's my first attempt, quickly going back here, to describe the basic character of our living space, which I've talked about in terms of inhabitation and home, but I just wanted to bring it back to his language in section 22, and especially to identify this crucial idea that closeness in our lived experience is a powerful notion, but it's a qualitative, so to speak, rather than a quantitative notion. It's about the meaningful experience of lived and practical intimacy rather than an indifferent mathematical calculation of numerical distance. Right? So I want you to think about closeness as characterizing things. And I just want to add one more thing that'll matter in a little while. So that's you could say that's a kind of feeling, right? Being close to something then is basically a matter of feeling familiar with it, feeling comfortable with it. So closeness, distance, spatial relationships are in a crucial way built out of things like the feeling of comfort or something like that. Okay, that we'll come back to that. Anyway, I hope what I've said there is already clear enough and should fit pretty closely with things we've said. I want to read one more thing now, and this is from section 23. We talk called the spatiality of being in the world, and basically wants to say, what does this mean about us? He says, well, what that means about us is that we are the kind of being, well, who can relate to things that way, right? And he's gonna have a name for it, and it's worth knowing this so you can understand his text. There is absolutely no other place in the world you will ever hear someone use this made-up word, or it's not a made-up word, but it's Heidegger's made-up usage of it as a technical term. But it's one of the terms that he emphasizes for how to think about things in this book, so it's worth having. Anyway, he's going to use the word Diseverance, or at least that's our translation here. And so he says, on page 139, he says, so he says at the bottom of 138, he says, Dasein's spatiality is characterized by disseverance and directionality. And so then he's going to talk about disseverance first. On 139, he says, disseverance stands for a constitutive state of Dasein's being, a state with regard to which removing something in the sense of putting it away is only determinate factical mode. You won't understand those words yet. Maybe you will in a minute. But it's the next sentence. And he says, Desevering or dissevering amounts to making the farness vanish. That is, making the remoteness of something different disappear, bringing it close. So the thing is, you become familiar with something, and in so doing, you sort of integrate it into your living engagement with things. That's making it close. When just think about when you move into an apartment, it takes a little bit of time, but eventually you feel comfortable there, and eventually you get to be like that woman I talked about on the couch in the Jeff Wall image, where she's comfortable in that apartment, and so that couch is close to her, so close to her that she doesn't even notice it, right? There, basically saying you've overcome the distance in that, or overcome the remoteness. Is that the word he uses? Yeah, making the remoteness of something disappear, where remoteness now means something more like alienness, right? It used to be something that, in terms of this experiential relationship of familiarity or not, things start off being in a way infinitely far away. You don't feel close to them at all. They're just, when you walk into that apartment, it's just an alien room. But by living there, you start to become close. And so the thing is, it's by developing a relationship with things that they can start to have a kind of a meaningful relationship to you. And so as you become comfortable in your apartment, in an important sense, that whole apartment becomes close to you. So you remove the remoteness. It's not far anymore. But at the same time, now, within your living in that close thing, there's a lived sense of distance that comes up. Like the kitchen is over there. The way to get a glass of water is over there. The way to go pee is over there. The way to satisfy your craving for a thing is to wherever the peanuts are. There, things have acquired places in that non-reflective, ready-to-hand kind of way. And so it's by bringing things close in that core sense of developing an intimate familiarity with them that it becomes possible for them to exist in a kind of integrated way at distances. Not distances in that mathematical sense of inches, but distances in the sense of where you turn to, where you reach in order to, and then there are all the different things. So it's just like the hammer. Like when you need to put a nail in, you reach for the hammer. When you need to drill a hole, you reach for the drill. So normally when you're working, neither the drill nor the hammer is figuring explicitly in your perception. But as soon as you need to hammer the nail, you grab the hammer, right? As soon as you need to drill a hole, you grab the drill. So that little sector of your work world rises up to prominence for you as you smoothly move through it to carry out your task that you're focused on, right? Well, just like we can say that about those things, the hammer and the tool, we can say it about the places, right? About space. Like the hammer and the tool are in their places, and places in turn are significances that can rise to the fore as you need to turn to them. But normally they lie inconspicuously waiting. And so it's interesting there that you can see your spatial engagement is in a way bigger than it actually is, bigger than it actually is. You're actually dealing with this, but you're implicitly always dealing with all of this stuff, such that when your needs change, this thing that was always there available to you rises to prominence, right? But normally it's just sort of lying there in wait. Anyway, so Diseverance amounts to making the farness vanish when something becomes experientially close. And that, but he says that lets an entity be encountered close by as the entity that it is, and he says it that in that sense discovers remoteness. Or earlier he said, the line I read at first, Diseverance is a state with regard to which removing something in the mode of putting it away is only a determinate factical mode, right? So in other words, you get the hammer and you put it away, like in a sense you move it farther away from you, like you're not using it now. That putting it away, that removing it, that making it experientially far or farther is a mode of having the thing close to you, right? In that lived world, farness, the degrees of farness are different modes of actually closeness. Anyway, so that's what he means by disseverance, that our way of inhabiting the world is a way of making a kind of home, and that means bringing things close to us such that they then become articulate in their lived distances from us. And that's quite different from a relationship to a just alien and indifferent world where we would just bounce off the surface. Anyway, so I wanted to go back and read that just to help you with those paragraphs from back in chapter 3, but also just to get us back into the experience of talking about what it's like to be in a situation. And I'm just going to make now one point here to sort of wrap it up. It'll take me a couple of minutes to wrap this up, and that will then allow us to launch into our discussion of the modes of being in. And so the point is this, right? To say we're being in the world is to say we inhabit a situation. In fact, there's more to say about what we inhabit, but that's enough for the moment. We inhabit a situation. And that inhabitation is the very fabric of it is something like an experience of familiarity or comfort. And in that living experience of comfort, we have that sense of how all these things we're dealing with are oriented towards a task, towards what we're doing. And that's roughly what he means by directionality, that the space we live in is oriented. Things have their places where the meaning of their places is that they are integrated. Like in the case of the card game, they're oriented, they're integrated in their orientation towards the playing of that game. Right? That's how we live in a space that is for playing cards, right? In that case. And so the places have their meaning. They're not just in different spots. They are relevant dimensions of how we inhabit the card playing space. And their very lived experiential sense is how they fit into that project. So our inhabitation is both, something that happens at the level of a kind of feeling, like we feel comfortable there. And that comfort is itself spelled out in terms of an understanding of this is for that, and these things fit together in that way. So our habitation of that situation is always a matter of feeling and a matter of intelligence, but not at the level of explicit cognition or anything like that. And then I want to say one more thing just about that scene. Let's go back and just look at the picture again for a minute. I want to say one more thing about that scene, and just to think about what these people are doing. Like, they're going to play this game and they're going to say whatever game they're playing, 3 hearts or I bid 2 or whatever. But they're also going to say, oh, did you hear that thing that President Trump said the other day? Oh, I saw a new person moved into the neighborhood or whatever. Like, think about what these people are going to do. They're not just going to sit there silently, because they are with one another, and so they're very playing out of the card game. They're putting down of the cards and saying, "Trump, I win," or whatever people say. That's part of the game, but also they're going to carry on their small talk and so on, whatever else. So the other thing to notice then is that the way they inhabit their situation is also, going back to what we said about being in a world with others, it's also one in which the situation is an experience of sharing something, experience of being with these people. And that means their inhabitation of it also leads them to express it, to talk about it. They talk, right? And so the very way, if you think of that situation, which I'm using as kind of typical of our average everydayness, of our being at home, it's being in is a matter of a feeling of comfortable familiarity. It's a matter of understanding the way all these things are related in a project, playing cards with these people. And it's a matter of being with those others in such a way that our living out of the situation is also constantly a kind of a giving voice to our experience of it. So if we, and I want to say one last thing. I just remembered this, and that is so that's our living situation, right? Back in one of the earlier lectures, I can't remember what it was. I talked about I said. I think it was when we were talking about the they, but I'm not sure. I was saying, often if we try to think about what things are, we step back and we stare at the world and say things. And I said, when you adopt that attitude, which we often wrongly think of as the neutral factual one, what we've actually done is looked at a corpse of our living experience, right? So I want to play off that language of sort of corpse versus alive, right? What I was just describing with these women is their lived experience of space, their lived experience of being in a situation. Whereas just staring at something and giving an inventory of the things and measuring their distances between them with a ruler, no doubt says certain things that are factually correct, but the thing that's being described there is not the world that someone lives in, right? It's you can take the world you're living in and step out of that experience and then bring a measure to it and sort of adopt a neutral standpoint on it. But in that case, you have a kind of corpse of a living situation. So anyway, the thing I want you to get at, the thing I want you to be thinking about is, what is our lived world like? What is our living engagement in a situation like? And I brought out those ideas of the comfortable inhabitation, the practical understanding of those things, and the way that we're in that with others, and we give voice to that in speaking. So that's a there I used that stuff about space from chapter 3 as a way to talk about what that lived experience of being in a situation as a mode of caring is like, and now we'll go on to talk more specifically about the modes of care that Heidegger talks about in chapter 5.